I almost didn't make this. But then I thought, what's the use of being 92 if I still can't finally say the things I've been carrying quietly for 2 decades? So here I am. And what I'm about to tell you might unsettle you. At 92, I've stopped worrying about whether every truth I tell makes people comfortable. I spent most of my life being agreeable. That particular chapter is closed now. I told my family everything. That was my mistake. Not all at once. It happened slowly, the way most real mistakes do. A confession here, an honest answer there, a moment where I thought, surely they can handle this. Surely they love me enough to hear the truth. They did love me enough. That was never the problem. The problem is that love and information are not the same thing, and I spent decades confusing the two. I'm going to tell you what happened to me, and then I'm going to tell you the 7 things you should never tell your family after 70. Not because they're bad people, mine certainly aren't, but because the moment certain words leave your mouth, something shifts in how they see you. And once it shifts, you cannot shift it back. I've tried. My name is Evelyn. I'm 92 years old. I've been a wife, a mother, a widow, and I overheard this once through a wall I didn't mean to be standing near. A burden. That's their word, not mine. But words like that don't wash off once you've heard them. I was married to Robert for 51 years. He worked most of his life as a machinist, and he brought that same precision home with him. Measured, exact, never one word more than the situation called for. For most of our marriage, I thought that was simply his limitation. Now, I think it might have been the smartest thing about him. He understood something I didn't, that some truths once spoken become weapons, not because you meant them that way, because the person receiving them wasn't ready to hold them, or heard something different than what you said, or because the plain truth is simply too heavy for some people to carry without dropping it directly on your head. I dropped a great deal of truth on my family over the years. They dropped a good deal of it back on me, sharper. I want to be clear before I go on. I love my children. I love Gregory, my eldest, who has his father's habit of tapping 2 fingers against his knee when he's working through a problem he won't say out loud yet. He manages a hardware supply warehouse and calls me every Sunday evening, whether he has news or not. I love Diane, my daughter, married to a good enough man named Kenneth, who has never once in 31 years remembered to bring napkins to a family cookout, though he remembers everything else. I love my youngest, Barbara, who has always been the one most willing to say the thing nobody else wanted spoken aloud. She gets that from me. I don't apologize for it, but I understand now more clearly than I once did what it cost her over the years. And I love my grandson Ethan, Diane's boy, filling out into a young man so quickly it startles me every time I see him. I love all of them completely. And I'm telling you these 7 things not because my family is cruel, but because love and unfiltered truth don't always build the same shelter. Sometimes too much honesty simply burns down the roof that was keeping everyone warm. The first thing I should have kept to myself. Listen closely because this one cost me more than I can easily explain. The first thing is exactly how much money you have. For 11 years before I married Robert, I worked as a bookkeeper at a lumber mill outside town, and I saved nearly every dollar of it, the way women of my generation were taught to. Quietly, without discussion, in a passbook savings account I kept even after Robert and I combined most of our finances. It was, I suppose, my own small private fortress, built dollar by dollar over a decade of ledgers and long division. I made the mistake of being completely transparent with my children about all of it. I told myself it was the responsible thing to do. They're adults, I thought. They should know where things stand in case something happens to me. So I told them. Gregory, Diane, Barbara, the savings from the mill what Robert's pension had become, what the house was worth after the market rose the way it did. I even mentioned the government bonds Robert had bought, one at a time, every birthday for 40 years, tucked inside an old cigar box on the top shelf of his closet, because he liked the feeling of something you could actually hold in your hand. I remember the exact evening I laid it all out. We were in my dining room, the good tablecloth still on from Easter, and I recited the numbers the way I once recited figures for the Mills quarterly reports. Clean, organized, complete. I swear to you, the temperature in that room changed. Not immediately. Gradually, the way a season shifts and you cannot name the precise day it turned until one morning you find yourself reaching for a coat you haven't worn in months. Gregory began calling more often, which sounds pleasant enough, except the calls always circled back to the house. Whether I'd considered downsizing, whether the gutters needed attention before winter, and wasn't that exactly the kind of expense I ought to be setting money aside for now? Diane mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that Kenneth's cousin worked at an investment firm downtown, and wouldn't it be wise to have someone just look things over? Barbara was the most direct about it, which somehow stung more. She said over coffee one afternoon, "Mom, maybe it would just be simpler if my name were on things too, in case anything happens." In case of what? In case I forget how to balance my own checkbook, the very thing I did professionally for 11 years before any of them existed. I didn't add anyone's name to anything, but something had already shifted. Now, when I purchase something slightly beyond ordinary, a good winter coat, a piece of furniture, tickets to see my sister in Ohio, I catch myself explaining it aloud, unprompted, as though I owe an accounting to someone who never actually asked. That's what happens when you disclose the exact shape of what you have. You hand your family a ledger, and suddenly your remaining years come with a budget you never agreed to. So, that is the first thing. Never disclose the precise number. You may say, "I'm comfortable. I'm provided for." That is sufficient. That is, in fact, more than sufficient. The details were always yours alone to hold. The second thing is who you trust more than the others. I want to describe exactly how this unfolded because its innocence is precisely what makes it so dangerous. It was an unremarkable Wednesday. Gregory had phoned about something entirely unrelated to me, a dispute with his own contractor over a fence line. And somewhere in the conversation I mentioned offhandedly that if I ever needed help with something urgent, I'd probably call Diane first. She lived 8 minutes away. She was steady under pressure in a way that had always reassured me. It wasn't a judgment against Gregory or Barbara. It was simply proximity and temperament. I thought nothing more of having said it. Gregory said nothing that day either. But roughly a month later, at a birthday gathering for Ethan, Barbara made a passing remark. Well, we all know Diane's the golden child, delivered with a small laugh that wasn't entirely a joke. I said, "That isn't true," and I meant it. But I noticed in the particular way Gregory's shoulders squared that this wasn't the first time he'd encountered that sentence. Diane had apparently mentioned at some point what I'd said on the phone, not out of malice, simply the way families repeat things without weighing their eventual cost. But once spoken aloud in front of all three of them, it stopped being a simple fact about distance. It became a verdict. For the better part of a year, I noticed small alterations. Gregory's visits grew shorter, more formal, carrying a politeness that had never existed between us before, as though he'd become a guest in a house he used to consider partly his own. Barbara made comments, always framed as humor, about being the emergency backup. I never said I trusted Diane more as a person. I said I would likely call her first for practical reasons because she lived closest and remained calm under pressure. That was geography and temperament, not affection. But once it left my mouth, it stopped being either of those things. It became a ranking. And rankings, once established inside a family, are nearly impossible to dissolve. I finally addressed it plainly with Gregory almost a year later, on a cool evening on my back steps. I told him I did not trust Diane more as a daughter. I told him that if I needed someone to sit beside me through something genuinely frightening, someone who could think clearly while everyone else panicked, that had always been him, since he was perhaps 12 years old. I had simply never said so aloud because it had never occurred to me that I needed to. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "You should have told me that a year ago instead of telling Diane something else entirely." He wasn't wrong. I hadn't withheld the truth about him intentionally. I had simply never imagined that an offhand remark about proximity would someday require a counterbalance. That is the second thing. Whatever private calculations you make about which child you might call for what, keep them entirely to yourself. Or better still, refrain even from ranking them privately in your own mind. The instant you name a preference, even an accidental one, you have handed your children a hierarchy to measure themselves against for the remainder of their lives. The third thing is how lonely you truly are. I don't mean the dramatic version people picture, weeping in a darkened room. That isn't what it resembles at 92. It is a Thursday afternoon with the radio on simply for the sound of a human voice while you water plants that don't particularly need watering yet. It is realizing you haven't spoken a full sentence aloud since Tuesday, when you thanked the mail carrier for a package you didn't actually order. It is glancing at the clock at 5:30 out of 41 years of habit, half expecting to hear Robert's truck turn into the driveway, before remembering freshly every single time that it won't. It is Robert's reading chair, still angled precisely toward the window the way he preferred it, 6 years after he stopped sitting in it. But you cannot tell your family how lonely you are, because to them, loneliness sounds like a malfunction requiring immediate repair, and their repairs are never the ones you actually need. I made the error of confiding in Barbara one unusually quiet evening on the phone, precisely how hollow the house had begun to feel some days. I'm not certain why I chose that particular night to say it. Perhaps I was more tired than usual. Within a week, there was a solution. Diane had created something she called a family calendar, a shared document on her computer that all three of them could access and update. Tuesday, Diane brings dinner. Thursday, Gregory calls at 7. Saturday, Barbara visits with Ethan. At first, I'll admit, it moved something in me. My children, organizing themselves around my company. I hadn't felt that arranged for since Robert was alive. It took perhaps 2 months for the feeling to change. I was on the phone with Gregory on a Thursday, and I heard him say something to someone else in his kitchen, his hand not quite covering the receiver well enough. "I can't do Mom this Thursday. Can you switch with me?" "Oh, Mom this Thursday. Not I want to call Mom. Not even I need to call Mom." Mom this Thursday spoken the way you'd speak of a chore rotation, a task assigned and traded among people managing a shared obligation. I said nothing to him about it. What was there to say? He wasn't wrong exactly. I had become on that calendar a recurring appointment, a Thursday, a Tuesday, a Saturday with a small clock icon beside my name. I don't require entertainment. I require someone who genuinely knows me. And the people who genuinely knew me are, for the most part, no longer living. That isn't self-pity, that is simply mathematics. By 92, you have outlived most witnesses to your own earlier life. The people who could say, "Remember that terrible ice storm in '68," and you'd both laugh without needing to explain another word of context. No calendar replaces that particular kind of knowing. Nothing does. You keep your loneliness private. You come to know its exact shape and weight. And on certain days, it isn't sharp at all. It becomes almost gentle, like a blanket you never requested, but grew accustomed to carrying regardless. That is simply what women of my age learn to do. We carry things quietly. The fourth thing is what you genuinely think about their marriage or how they're raising your grandchildren. I made this particular error twice in two distinct ways, and I'll describe both. The first involved Kenneth, Diane's husband. Kenneth is not an unkind man. I want to state that clearly. He is steady, faithful, generous with his time, and he has an inexplicable devotion to a fantasy football league that has occupied every autumn Sunday for the past decade. But early in their marriage, Kenneth made a decision about refinancing their home that struck me as unwise, and I said as much once, gently, or so I believed at the time. Diane did not hear gently. She heard her mother questioning the man she had chosen to spend her life alongside. We did not speak for nearly 5 months. 5 months of silence over a single honest sentence about a decision that, as it happened, worked out perfectly well regardless. When she finally telephoned, she said something I have never forgotten. "Mom, when you criticize Kenneth, you're not only criticizing Kenneth, you're telling me I chose incorrectly, and I cannot hear that from you and still feel settled about my own marriage." The second error involved Ethan, my grandson Diane's boy. He was 15 at the time, moving through that particular stretch where every emotion arrives at maximum volume. I mentioned to Diane once that I thought she was being overly harsh with him about his grades. Diane was genuinely furious, not loud about it. Cold, which with her has always been considerably worse. She said, "You don't get to instruct me on raising my own son, Mom. You weren't flawless yourself." And then she recited a list. Things I had said and done raising her that I had mostly forgotten, or had quietly hoped she'd forgotten as well. She had retained every single one, filed away like receipts, waiting patiently for the appropriate moment to be produced in full. That evening taught me something essential. Your adult children do not actually want your accumulated wisdom about their marriages or their own children. They want your approval. That is the entirety of it. They want you to nod and assure them they're managing beautifully, even on days you privately harbor doubt. That isn't dishonesty. That is love in its most practical, most necessary configuration. Understanding precisely when honesty serves a purpose and when it merely draws blood for no useful reason whatsoever. Robert understood this by instinct alone. He never once commented on how Gregory disciplined his own children or how Kenneth managed household finances. Not a single word, even in instances where I know privately he disagreed. I once believed that was simply avoidance on his part. I now understand it was among the kindest things he ever did. Silence offered deliberately as an actual gift. The fifth thing is what's written in your will, and precisely who receives what. This is the regret that stings most specifically, because my intentions were genuinely good. I believed I was being helpful by discussing it openly, preventing future disputes, avoiding surprises after I'm gone. That was my reasoning. So, one Easter Sunday, with all 3 of them present at my table, I mentioned quite casually how I'd arrange things. The house would eventually pass to Gregory, since he'd always spoken of wanting to raise his own children in that particular neighborhood. A specific sum was designated for Diane. Barbara would receive Robert's collection of tools and his old workbench, since she was the only one who'd ever expressed genuine interest in using them. Nobody argued that particular afternoon. Everyone simply nodded. It seemed in that moment like precisely the peaceful conversation I had hoped to have. The consequences arrived gradually, as they invariably do. A few months later, Diane mentioned, almost incidentally, that the driveway at the house, meaning my house, meaning Gregory's eventual house, really ought to be repaved before winter arrived. Not her driveway. Mine, already discussed as though it belonged to someone else's future plans. Barbara began asking more than once when I intended to finally retire Robert's old workbench from active use, since she'd been meaning to properly organize a workshop space of her own. And once at a family gathering, I overheard Gregory mentioning to his wife, not unkindly, that once this place is officially ours, were finally taking down that back wall. He wasn't aware I'd hurt him. He wasn't attempting cruelty. He was simply planning ahead, the way people naturally do once an ending has been given both a shape and a specific name. I sat alone in my own kitchen several weeks afterward, considering the wall Gregory had already begun rearranging in his imagination, the workbench Barbara was already waiting to inherit, the growing sense that Diane now viewed my home's upkeep as an investment toward her brother's eventual property, rather than simply the maintenance of my own residence. I had converted my own possessions into their inheritance while I was still actively living among every single one of them. That is the danger inherent in the fifth thing. The moment you announce who receives what, those possessions cease being entirely yours in everyone's perception, including eventually your own. You begin to feel less like the owner of your own life and more like a temporary caretaker, holding items in trust on behalf of people who are, quite naturally, already glancing slightly past you toward whatever comes next. I have since informed them that arrangements exist, that everything is equitable, that there is nothing requiring their concern. But I have stopped disclosing the particulars. What remains mine stays entirely mine, without qualification or asterisk, until it inevitably isn't. That has become the only method I've discovered for continuing to actually live inside my own house, rather than simply standing guard over it on someone else's behalf. The sixth thing is everything regarding who you were before any of them existed, before you were simply mom, before the version of you they've always known was the only version that seemed possible. I made this particular mistake one Thanksgiving, the first one following Robert's passing. The gravy had turned out slightly too thin that year, and everyone noticed and nobody mentioned it. I told them something I had never told a living soul, that 3 weeks before my wedding to Robert, I very nearly called it off. It wasn't another man. That's the part I need you to understand before I go further, because my children immediately assumed it was, and once they assumed it, nothing I said afterward could fully dislodge the assumption. It was simpler than that, and somehow harder to explain. I had a moment sitting alone in my mother's sewing room with the dress already altered and hanging on the door, where I looked at the whole shape of the life ahead of me. Robert's quiet, Robert's precision, 50 years of a man who said exactly what needed saying and not one word more. And I felt something close to panic, not because I doubted him, because I doubted whether I was ready to stop being simply myself and start being someone's wife instead. I told my own mother I wasn't certain I could go through with it. She didn't argue with me, and she didn't comfort me either. She said, "Evelyn, nobody is ever certain. You're not deciding whether you're afraid. You're deciding whether he's worth being afraid for." And then she went back to her ironing as though she'd said nothing of particular importance at all. I married Robert 3 weeks later. I never once regretted it, not for a single day across 51 years. But I told my children the wrong part of that story that Thanksgiving. I told them about the panic, about nearly calling it off without properly landing on the part that mattered, that choosing him afterward with my eyes fully open to my own fear was the most certain thing I ever did. Gregory, who carries Robert's exact posture and Robert's particular tendency toward silence whenever something genuinely wounds him, went very quiet at the table. Later in the kitchen, he said, "So you almost didn't want him, and we never knew that." I hadn't doubted Robert. I had doubted myself briefly, the way every young woman standing at the edge of an enormous decision doubts herself. But Gregory couldn't quite hold that distinction. What he retained was simpler and far more painful. Mom almost didn't choose Dad. Diane asked gently whether that meant I'd been unhappy all those years, secretly wondering. I hadn't been. not for 1 hour of one day. But the question itself told me the damage was already done. They no longer heard the marriage the same way. Somewhere behind every anniversary, every family photograph, there was now a small asterisk that hadn't existed the week before. That is the real danger in sharing your past, even the parts that resolve beautifully. You edit it even while believing yourself entirely honest, and the edited version can plant a doubt in your children's minds that outlives the actual truth by decades, and so keep your past entirely to yourself. The fears, the nearly made mistakes, the earlier version of yourself that existed long before their arrival, uncertain in ways they've never once imagined. Those belong exclusively to you. Your children have no genuine need for the woman who once stood at the edge of doubt. They require the woman who chose and stayed and built 51 years from that choosing. And the fear that came before it might only raise questions that never required raising whatsoever. The seventh thing, the final one, and the heaviest, is that you've made genuine peace with the fact that you will not remain here indefinitely. I do not intend this darkly. I am not eager for it. At 92, I don't spend much time pretending I'm going to be here forever. That doesn't frighten me anymore. Apparently, it frightens my children. I no longer fear it the way I did at 62, when the mere concept made me grip my own bedsheets through the night. At 92, time and I have arrived at something resembling mutual understanding. I have had sufficient time, not excessive, I remain grateful, but sufficient. I am in no particular hurry toward it. I am also at this point no longer fleeing from it. I said something quite close to this to Diane this past spring. We were seated on my back steps, the ones Robert reinforced himself the autumn before he passed, though they creak now in places they never used to. She was describing some vacation she wished to plan for the two of us together. I told her gently, "Sweetheart, I have no need of a vacation. I've witnessed enough. When it's time, it will simply be time, and I won't resist it." I intended it as genuine kindness, a way of communicating, "Please don't carry this particular weight on my behalf. I am truly, entirely all right." Diane wept, not quietly. The identical, helpless sound she made at 7 years old when her bicycle was stolen from our own front yard. Then she grew furious. "Don't speak that way, Mom. Don't you dare speak that way." As though my own genuine peace with my own mortality constituted some form of cruelty directed at her. As though I owed her the performance of believing decades remained ahead of me, purely to spare her the discomfort of accurate information. I do not have decades remaining. I may not possess years, and I have made my peace with precisely that. But I can never state it plainly again, because when you inform your family you're at peace with dying, they do not register peace. They register surrender. They register abandonment. They register somewhere beneath the surface, "She doesn't love us sufficiently to want to remain." That was never my meaning. I meant that I love them sufficiently not to transform my own death into their emergency. I meant that my own plate has been genuinely, thoroughly full, and I require no additional serving. They cannot hear that particular truth yet. Perhaps not until they themselves reach 92. I hope, quite sincerely, that each of them eventually does. I understand people generally desire tidy wisdom from elderly women, small, manageable lessons wrapped neatly in ribbon. I have none of that to offer you today. I have 7 genuine regrets. I have a house that feels considerably too large now, and a heart that remains far too full. And I've learned that most of what I once labeled honesty was simply information I hadn't yet learned to properly keep. But I remain here. I remain speaking, and if you're genuinely listening, perhaps you'll manage what I did not. Perhaps you'll leave a few particular doors closed, not from dishonesty, simply because certain truths were only ever meant to belong exclusively to the person who actually lived them. An old woman's silence isn't absence, it is simply the boundary she finally learned to draw around the few pieces of her life that still belong entirely to her. I've left one question in the comment pinned beneath this video. I'm not requesting you answer it for my benefit. Answer it quietly for your own. Once this video concludes, choose your silence with genuine care. Not all silence indicates weakness. Some of it remains the final, quiet gift you still have left to offer the people you love most completely.